Welcome, dear listeners, to a story that transcends the ordinary, a story about the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the profound impact that even a small act of kindness can have. Today we take you on an unforgettable journey through the bustling streets of an American city, where a 10-year-old boy named Jack and a homeless man named Walter prove that true friendship can change lives. Grab a warm drink, sit back, and let your heart be touched by this tale of hope and humanity. It was an ordinary late autumn afternoon in a bustling American city. People hurried along crowded sidewalks, their footsteps blending with the steady hum of traffic. The streets were lined with tall, imposing buildings that seemed indifferent to the lives that passed beneath them. In a quiet, shadowy corner of the street, an old homeless man sat alone. His clothes were worn and threadbare, and his face, etched with lines of hardship, spoke of countless cold nights and difficult days. His eyes, once bright, now seemed distant, as if resigned to the fact that hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. The old man's name was Walter. He had been living on the streets for over a decade, moving from one corner to another, trying to scrape by. Once upon a time, Walter had a family, a home, and a job he loved. But tragedy struck, shattering his world. His wife and young daughter had been killed in a car accident that left him devastated. The pain of losing everything drove him to the streets, where each day felt like an eternity of survival rather than living. Across the street, a 10-year-old boy named Jack was walking home from school. Unlike other children who passed the homeless with a mix of fear, indifference, or occasional pity, Jack's eyes were drawn to Walter. There was something in Walter's hollow gaze that stirred Jack's curiosity, a silent cry for help that seemed to pierce through the bustling city noise. Jack slowed his steps, and before he knew it, he found himself standing just a few feet away from the old man. For a moment, Walter looked up, startled by the presence of the boy. He wasn't used to people stopping, let alone a child sitting down in front of him. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" Walter asked, his voice raspy from days without proper hydration. Jack, instead of feeling intimidated by the man's rugged appearance, responded with an innocent sincerity. "I just wanted to sit with you. Are you okay? You look tired." Walter let out a short, hollow laugh, one that carried a hint of bitterness. "Tired? Yeah, that's one way to put it, kid. But I'm more than tired. I'm lost." The honesty of Walter's words struck Jack, but instead of turning away, Jack felt a deeper empathy. "My mom always says that sometimes when you're lost, all you need is a friend," Jack said earnestly. Walter's eyes softened at the boy's words. It had been so long since he had felt any sort of kindness. He shifted slightly, making room for Jack on the cold sidewalk. Jack sat down cross-legged, placing his backpack beside him. As they sat together, Walter couldn't help but notice Jack rummaging through his bag. A moment later, the boy pulled out a slightly crumpled sandwich, wrapped in clear plastic. It was Jack's lunch that his mother had packed for him earlier in the day. Without hesitation, he offered it to Walter. "You can have this, Mr. Walter. My mom always packs extra." Walter looked at the sandwich, then back at Jack, unsure if he should accept. He hadn't had a proper meal in days, and the sight of the sandwich made his stomach rumble. But beyond the food itself, it was the sincerity of the offer that moved him. "Thank you, kid. What's your name?" Walter asked, his voice now softer, almost gentle. "I'm Jack," the boy answered, smiling widely. As Walter took a bite of the sandwich, tears began to well up in his eyes. It wasn't just hunger that made him emotional. It was the fact that someone, for the first time in a very long time, had shown him genuine compassion. With each bite, Walter felt a bit of warmth returning to his body and soul. "Jack, you're a good kid," Walter said after finishing the sandwich. "Why did you stop to talk to an old man like me?" Jack thought for a moment before responding. "I don't know. I guess I felt like you needed someone to talk to. My teacher always says that sometimes people need kindness the most when they seem the farthest away from it." Walter was taken aback by the wisdom in the boy's words. Here was a child, barely a decade old, offering more understanding than most adults he had encountered. Walter's eyes softened further as he opened up, telling Jack about his life, his family, and the accident that had left him on the streets. He spoke of the days when he still had a home, when his daughter's laughter filled the air, and when he still had dreams. Jack listened intently, his heart aching for Walter. He had never experienced such loss himself, but he could feel the weight of Walter's grief as if it were his own. Tears began to fill Jack's eyes too, not out of pity, but from a deep sense of empathy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walter," Jack said quietly, his voice barely audible above the street noise. "But I think you're really strong. You're still here, even after everything." Walter's eyes, now filled with tears, met Jack's. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered emotion, one that transcended age, circumstance, and background. "You know, Jack, you might be the only friend I've had in years," Walter admitted, his voice breaking. Jack's face lit up. "Then we're friends for real now, okay? I'll come back tomorrow, and we can talk some more." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jack stood up, dusting off his pants. He reached out and handed Walter a small, worn-out dollar bill from his pocket. "It's not much, but it's all I have," Jack said apologetically. Walter hesitated before accepting it. "This is more than enough, Jack. You've given me more than just money today." Jack waved goodbye and began walking home, turning back one last time to see Walter sitting there, his eyes no longer empty but filled with a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, Walter felt that perhaps he wasn't entirely alone, that maybe life still had something left to offer. As Jack disappeared into the crowd, Walter whispered to himself, "Maybe tomorrow will be better." And for the first time in a very long time, Walter believed it could be. Jack's heart was light as he made his way home. Though he couldn't fully comprehend Walter's suffering, he knew he'd done something good that day. When he reached home, his mother, Mrs. Reynolds, was waiting for him at the door. She noticed the absence of the second sandwich in his lunchbox. "Where's your other sandwich, Jack?" she asked, half curious, half concerned. Jack paused for a moment, unsure how she might react to what he had done. "I gave it to someone who needed it more than I did," he replied earnestly. Mrs. Reynolds knelt down to look Jack in the eyes, a mix of surprise and pride in her expression. "Who was it?" she asked softly. "A man named Walter. He's homeless. He looked hungry, so I shared my lunch with him," Jack explained. His mother's eyes softened, filled with a motherly pride. "You did a kind thing, Jack, but remember, be careful around strangers, okay?" she advised gently. Jack nodded, but in his heart, he felt that Walter wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was a friend, someone who needed a bit of warmth in his life. The following day, Jack rushed through his schoolwork, eager to finish early. When the final bell rang, he sprinted out of school and hurried to the same corner where he'd met Walter the day before. As he approached, his heart sank a little. Walter wasn't there. But just as he was about to leave, he heard a familiar, hoarse voice behind him. "Hey, Jack." Jack turned around, and there was Walter, sitting on a different spot but still within the same area. His face brightened when he saw the boy approaching. "I thought you might not come back," Walter admitted, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Jack shook his head. "I promised I'd be here, remember? Friends don't break promises." They sat together again, but this time, the conversation flowed more naturally. Jack brought another sandwich, and Walter accepted it gratefully. The two spoke of many things. Walter's memories of his daughter, who would have been Jack's age now, and Jack's dreams of becoming a firefighter one day. Walter smiled wistfully at the boy's innocent ambitions, feeling a pang of nostalgia for the days when his own dreams felt within reach. Day after day, Jack returned to Walter's corner after school. The two shared sandwiches, stories, and moments of silent understanding. Walter began to look healthier. The kindness he received from Jack seemed to fill him with a renewed will to live. The unusual friendship between a homeless man and a young boy soon caught the attention of the locals. Some people, inspired by Jack's actions, started to leave food, blankets, and clothes for Walter. A small community of kindness formed around the street corner, all sparked by one child's decision to sit down and listen. But it wasn't just Walter's life that was changing. Jack, too, was learning valuable lessons. He learned about resilience, about facing adversity with dignity, and most of all, about the power of compassion. His mother noticed this change in him as well. Jack was becoming more empathetic, more aware of the struggles of others, and more determined to make a difference. One cold evening, as winter crept in, Jack found Walter coughing uncontrollably, his body shivering despite the layers of clothes he wore. Alarmed, Jack immediately ran home to tell his mother. Mrs. Reynolds, worried about Walter's health, decided to take action. She wrapped up a warm blanket, prepared a flask of hot soup, and accompanied Jack back to Walter's corner. "Walter, you need to get checked by a doctor," Mrs. Reynolds urged. "This cough sounds serious." But Walter, stubborn in his pride, shook his head. "I can't afford it, man, and I don't want to be a burden." Jack, his voice almost pleading, said, "But you'll get worse if you stay out here, Walter. You promised we'd be friends, and friends don't leave each other behind." Walter's eyes filled with tears once again. The boy's words were simple, but they carried the weight of an unbroken promise, something Walter hadn't experienced in years. Reluctantly, he agreed to go to a nearby free clinic that Mrs. Reynolds knew about. At the clinic, Walter was diagnosed with severe pneumonia, and he was admitted to a temporary shelter where he could receive treatment. Jack visited him every day after school, bringing small gifts like books and puzzles to keep him entertained. Walter's health slowly improved, and as it did, he began to share more of his dreams with Jack. "You know, Jack," Walter said one day as he rested in the shelter, "I used to be a teacher. I loved working with kids, just like you." Jack's eyes widened with surprise. "You were a teacher? That's amazing. Maybe one day you can teach again." Walter smiled, the first real smile that reached his eyes. "Maybe, Jack. Maybe one day." As weeks passed, Walter's health stabilized, and the shelter offered him a spot in a job training program. It wasn't a grand solution, but it was a start. A small step toward reclaiming the life he had lost. On the day he graduated from the program, Jack was there, clapping louder than anyone else. Walter's eyes brimmed with gratitude as he approached Jack and Mrs. Reynolds. "I wouldn't be here without you two. You gave me a reason to hope again." Mrs. Reynolds smiled warmly. "You've always had the strength within you, Walter. Jack just reminded you of it." Jack beamed with pride, knowing that he had made a real difference in someone's life. One day, as they sat together on a bench outside the shelter, Walter turned to Jack with a serious expression. "Jack, you know what you've done for me, right? You've saved more than just my body. You saved my soul." Jack, slightly embarrassed but proud, replied, "I just wanted to be your friend, Walter." Walter's voice was filled with emotion as he spoke. "You are, Jack. You're the best friend I've ever had." And from that day on, as the city continued its bustle and pace, Jack and Walter's friendship remained a constant, a testament to the power of compassion, kindness, and the belief that even the smallest act of love can ignite a beacon of hope in the darkest of corners. As winter deepened, the friendship between Jack and Walter grew even stronger. Jack's daily visits to the shelter became a cherished routine for both of them. Walter, once a man with only the shadows of the past to cling to, now had hope for the future. Hope that sprang from Jack's simple acts of kindness. Jack's mother, Mrs. Reynolds, was deeply moved by her son's unwavering compassion. She had always raised Jack to be empathetic, but even she was surprised by how determined he was to help Walter rebuild his life. She started organizing small efforts to support the local shelter, including food drives and clothing donations. The community, inspired by Jack's dedication, rallied behind the cause. Local stores and residents pitched in, bringing supplies, warm meals, and resources that made the shelter a warmer place, both literally and figuratively. Despite the joy of seeing Walter's health improve, Jack began to understand the harsh realities of homelessness. One cold night, as the first snow of the season started to fall, Jack overheard Walter talking to another shelter resident, Sam, about the constant fear of not knowing if the shelter would have space for them every night. "It's a gamble, you know," Walter said, his voice low but steady. "Sometimes it feels like life itself is a game of chance. One bad roll, and you're out in the cold." Jack, listening from the hallway, felt a heavy knot forming in his chest. He knew Walter's struggles weren't over yet, and a burning determination took hold of him. He had to do more, not just for Walter, but for everyone in similar situations. Jack couldn't stop thinking about Walter's words. As he sat in class the next day, an idea began to form in his mind. When he got home, he hurriedly shared it with his mother. "Mom, what if we could raise enough money to help the shelter expand? I want to make sure Walter and others like him have a safe place to stay all winter, Jack said, his eyes shining with excitement. Mrs. Reynolds, though surprised by her son's ambitious idea, couldn't help but smile. That's a wonderful idea, Jack. But how do you plan to raise the money? She asked gently. Jack paused, then said confidently, a fundraiser. We could organize a community event, maybe a winter fair. We could have games, food, and activities, and all the money raised could go to the shelter. Mrs. Reynolds was taken aback by Jack's determination. She knew this would be a big challenge, but Jack's enthusiasm was contagious. Over the next few days, she helped Jack create flyers, plan activities, and spread the word. They knocked on neighbors' doors, called local businesses, and even spoke to the mayor's office to gain support. The community embraced Jack's vision with open arms. Local restaurants agreed to donate food, musicians volunteered to perform, and even some local artists offered their crafts for sale at the event. Walter, hearing of Jack's efforts, was deeply touched. He watched as a mere child mobilized an entire community to bring about change. You're making a real difference, Jack, Walter said one evening as they sat on the shelter's front steps. I've never seen anything like it. Jack, with a modest grin, replied, I just want you to have a real home one day, Walter. You and everyone else who's been forgotten. Walter's eyes glistened with pride. Jack's dream was no longer just his own. It had become a shared vision for a brighter, more compassionate community. The big day finally arrived. Despite the freezing temperatures, the fairgrounds were bustling with people. There were colorful stalls selling homemade crafts, warm drinks, and delicious winter treats. Children played games, laughter filled the air, and the sound of holiday music echoed joyfully. Jack, wearing a warm woolen hat, stood by the main donation booth, eagerly welcoming visitors. Walter, bundled up in a donated coat and scarf, was at his side, offering to share his story with those who were willing to listen. His vulnerability and sincerity struck a chord with the crowd, making them realize that homelessness had a human face, a face just like Walter's. The fair turned out to be a tremendous success. By the end of the day, they had raised more money than Jack had ever imagined. The donations were enough not only to expand the shelter's capacity, but also to provide basic health care, hot meals, and job training for the residents. Jack and Walter stood in awe as the final tally was announced, tears of joy streaming down their faces. We did it, Walter. We really did it. Jack shouted with excitement, hugging Walter tightly. Walter, his voice choked with emotion, whispered, No, you did it, Jack. You brought the community together. You believed in us when no one else did. The funds raised by Jack's winter fair led to significant improvements at the shelter. Walter, along with many other residents, was given a stable place to stay through the coldest months of winter. He also received job training through a local program, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. As spring approached, Walter surprised Jack with a piece of news. Jack, I found a job, Walter said one sunny afternoon, a wide smile on his face. I'll be working as a part-time caretaker at the shelter. It's not much, but it's a start. Jack's eyes widened with joy. That's amazing, Walter. I knew you could do it. Walter nodded, gratitude filling his heart. And it's all because of you, Jack. You showed me that kindness isn't just a word. It's a force that can change lives. You changed mine. But Walter wasn't the only one who had changed. Jack, too, had grown in ways he never imagined. He understood that kindness had a ripple effect. It started small, like a pebble dropped in a pond, but its impact could extend far beyond what the eye could see. Jack's efforts inspired other children at his school to start similar projects, reaching out to help those in need. The shelter's success story spread across the city, becoming a symbol of what one person's compassion could achieve when amplified by a community's support. Walter eventually moved into a small apartment, earning enough to live independently for the first time in years. But he never forgot the boy who had reached out to him when no one else did. On Jack's birthday that spring, Walter gave him a small, hand-carved wooden heart, a simple token of gratitude, but one filled with deep meaning. This is for you, Jack, Walter said, handing him the gift. It's a reminder that the greatest power we have is the power to care. Jack, holding the wooden heart tightly, replied, Thank you, Walter. You're my best friend. As time passed, Jack and Walter remained close friends, their bond unbroken by circumstances. The boy who had once shared a sandwich with a stranger was now a young advocate for the homeless, while the man who had once been lost in darkness had found a new light in his life. And so, in a city that often seemed indifferent to the plight of the forgotten, one small boy's compassion had brought about change. Change that began with a simple act of sitting down and listening. The story of Jack and Walter became more than just a tale of friendship. It became a story of hope, proving that even in the harshest winters of life, a single act of kindness can ignite a lasting warmth. As the days grew longer and warmer, the city's landscape began to change, mirroring the transformation in Walter's life. The shelter had not only expanded its capacity, but also established new programs to help residents regain their footing. Walter's role as a caretaker at the shelter allowed him to become a mentor for others, sharing both his struggles and his triumphs. His experience became a source of inspiration for new arrivals who were overwhelmed by the challenges of homelessness. Jack, now known as the little miracle worker among the community, continued to visit the shelter regularly. But Jack wasn't just a visitor. He was part of a broader mission that aimed to address homelessness with both empathy and practical solutions. His efforts had sparked a ripple effect, motivating other young people in the city to step forward with their own initiatives. One afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds received an unexpected phone call. It was from the mayor's office, inviting Jack to speak at a special event at City Hall. The event aimed to highlight the importance of youth involvement in community service, and Jack's story was seen as a perfect example. When Jack heard about the invitation, he was both thrilled and nervous. He had never spoken in front of a large audience before. Walter, sensing Jack's anxiety, decided to offer some words of encouragement. "Jack, you've already done the hardest part," Walter said with a warm smile. "You showed kindness when it mattered the most. Speaking about it is just telling people the truth, and you're good at that." Jack felt reassured, and when the day of the event arrived, he stood confidently on the stage. His speech, though simple, was powerful. "I'm just a kid, but I believe that kindness doesn't need to be complicated. Sometimes, all it takes is to sit down next to someone and listen. Walter taught me that. And now, we all need to remember that each of us can make a difference, one act of kindness at a time." The audience gave Jack a standing ovation, and the mayor personally commended him for his efforts. The story of Jack and Walter soon spread beyond the city, becoming a symbol of what one person's compassion, combined with a community's support, could achieve. As summer approached, Walter began to dream again, dreams he had long thought impossible. He had always loved teaching, and the idea of returning to that passion started to feel more like a possibility than a fantasy. The shelter, recognizing Walter's potential, offered to help him enroll in a teaching assistant training program at a local community college. Walter, with a renewed sense of purpose, accepted the offer. He wanted to teach not only academic subjects but also life lessons, lessons about resilience, hope, and the power of human connection. Jack was overjoyed when he heard the news. "You're going to be an amazing teacher, Walter," Jack exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. Walter, his heart swelling with gratitude, replied, "I hope so, Jack. And I hope to teach kids to see the world the way you do, with an open heart." The first day of Walter's classes at the community college was nerve-wracking. It had been years since he had stepped into a classroom setting, but his memories of teaching flooded back, bringing with them a sense of familiarity. His fellow students, mostly younger adults, were surprised to learn about Walter's past. His story made him a figure of respect, and many looked up to him as a source of inspiration. One Saturday morning, as Jack and his mother were preparing to visit Walter, they received an unexpected call. It was the director of the shelter, inviting them to a special event, a ceremony to honor those who had made a difference in the lives of the homeless community. When they arrived, Jack was taken aback by the crowd. It seemed like the entire community had gathered to show their support. There were volunteers, local officials, shelter residents, and many people who had heard about Jack and Walter's story. A makeshift stage was set up in the shelter's courtyard, decorated with colorful banners and flowers. Walter, dressed neatly in a new shirt, stood on the stage. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Jack. The two exchanged a knowing smile, one filled with the unspoken bond they had shared over the past year. The shelter director stepped forward and began speaking. Today we celebrate the power of kindness. We celebrate the efforts of our community to make a difference. But above all, we celebrate the friendship that changed everything. The friendship between a young boy and a man who had lost his way. She then motioned for Walter and Jack to come forward. Walter spoke first, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I want to thank this community for giving me a second chance at life. But most of all, I want to thank Jack, the boy who saw me not as a homeless man, but as a person. Jack reminded me that no one is truly lost as long as someone believes in them. Walter's words brought tears to many eyes, and when Jack stepped up to speak, he was greeted by cheers and applause. Jack's message was simple, but heartfelt. Walter showed me that being a hero doesn't mean you have to do big things. Sometimes the biggest thing you can do is be there for someone when they need it the most. Months later, as summer turned to autumn again, it was time for Walter to graduate from his teaching assistant program. Jack was there, along with Mrs. Reynolds and several shelter residents who had come to support him. The ceremony was small, but filled with pride and joy. Walter, wearing a graduation gown, couldn't believe he had come this far. After the ceremony, Walter approached Jack with a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. To my best friend Jack, thank you for giving me a chance to start over. You made me believe in miracles again. This is only the beginning. Walter's eyes were filled with tears as he handed the note to Jack. Jack, I couldn't have done this without you, Walter said, his voice breaking. You gave me back my hope and my life. Jack, tears in his own eyes, hugged Walter tightly. I just wanted you to be happy, Walter. And I'm so proud of you. As Jack and Walter's story continued, their friendship became a lasting example of how even the smallest acts of kindness can lead to profound change. Jack's efforts inspired others to take action, and soon the shelter was able to implement more programs to help residents transition into stable housing and employment. Walter, now a teaching assistant at a local elementary school, found immense joy in working with children. He often shared stories from his past, using them as lessons about resilience, compassion, and second chances. Jack, now in middle school, remained an active advocate for the homeless, organizing fundraisers and rallies to support those still struggling on the streets. But the most meaningful part of their story was not just the changes they inspired in others, but the bond that remained between them, a bond that had transformed both their lives forever. Jack, no longer just a child, grew up with a deep understanding of humanity's capacity for both suffering and kindness. Walter, once a man with no hope, had found not only stability, but a reason to keep dreaming. And so, in the heart of a city once indifferent to the plight of the homeless, a legacy of compassion was born. Jack and Walter's story wasn't just about one act of kindness. It was about the belief that every person, no matter how lost, could find a way back to the light when someone was willing to reach out a hand. The ripples of their friendship would continue to spread, reminding all who heard their tale that, no matter how small, kindness has the power to change the world, one life at a time. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heartwarming story. Jack and Walter's journey is more than just a tale. It's a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can ignite change. If you believe in the power of compassion, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Together, we can spread these messages of hope and make the world a little brighter, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of our community, and we hope to see you again in our next inspiring story.